Hello. Today we finish the Magic Mountain, so let us begin. There have been many surprises in Hans Castorp's education on the Magic Mountain, but perhaps the most unpredictable turn in this Bildungsroman comes in the aftermath of Papercorn's death. For the first time since his arrival, this young man who has been so consumed with curiosity about life and death, matter and spirit, love and disease, is bored. He finds himself, quote, at a dead standstill. Claudia has left once again, parting with, quote, a respectful and considered farewell, and with no promise of return this time. Papercorn's suicide and their failure to prevent it casts a pall over their shared guilt and loss, and that prevents their relationship from renewing the passionate promise of that Russian kiss that they had exchanged before Papercorn's death. In addition to this, Hans has completely lost his interest by this point in Settembrini and Naptha's repetitive debates. Behrens notes his glumness and offers a diagnosis that proves to be as inadequate as his theory that Hans's continuing temperature in the absence of any evidence of remaining tuberculosis is due to a lingering strep infection. Both diagnoses are short-sighted. And just as those diagnoses and treatment miss the mark, so too does Behrens' reading of Hans's strange mental lethargy, which he describes early in the chapter this way. You've been pampered with thrills, Hans, and if you don't get a first-class kick every day, you sulk and fret about in the doldrums. Am I right or am I wrong? Hans Castorp said nothing, and in doing so only revealed the gloom within. What Behrens fails to see is that Hans isn't merely bored in a conventional sense. Rather, he shares in a great stupor that afflicts the entire community at the Berghof, which Hans has, quote, come like them to feel a complete standstill within himself. Well, for Hans especially, this standstill goes beyond ennui. It constitutes an existential crisis, one in which Hans has lost not just his curiosity about life for the first time, but also lost a sense of the value of life and a certain weakening of the vital will to live. Those principles that were, after all, revealed to him so forcefully in the dream that he had in snow. Now they seem very much at risk. We're told it seemed to Hans Castorp that not only had he come to this dead standstill, but that the world, all of it, the whole thing, was in much the same state. Or rather, he found it difficult up here to separate the particular from the general. Ever since the eccentric conclusion to his relationship with a certain personality and all the changes that conclusion had set into motion at the sanitarium, ever since Claudia Chauchat's renewed departure from society of those up here, including a respectful, considered farewell to her master's surviving brother, exchanged beneath the shadow cast by the tragedy of that great failure. Ever since that turning point, it had seemed to the young man as if there were something uncanny about the world and life, as if there was something peculiar, something increasingly askew and disquieting about it, as if a demon had seized power, and that demon's name was stupor. Thus, he knew what it was that he saw. It was life without time, without care or hope. Life as stagnating, hustle-bustle of depravity, mere dead life, it seemed to Hans. Hans's elemental urge to live and to seek knowledge, his mythic role in life, has atrophied at this point, and none of the desperate diversions that Hans and the other residents undertake to allay their sense of emptiness, this stupor, provides a remedy to it. These diversions include things like flash photography, which only exposes their underlying lethargy by capturing it in images. People caught in flash magnetism with vacant eyes stared dully from their frozen faces in cramped expressions, as if the corpses of murder victims had been set in chairs with their eyes wide open. The stupor is evoked in the language of paralysis and death. In an attempt to fill the void that the residents all feel within themselves to differing degrees, they resort to various pursuits, everything from chocolate to drawing to schemes for newspaper recycling. The lawyer Pavarant becomes obsessed with calculating pi in an attempt to solve the ancient mathematical problem of squaring the circle, a futile endeavor that torments him. Hans's response to Pavarant's obsession is particularly revealing of how he has changed since Papercorn and Joachim's death. Now we're told that Hans spoke of the elastic turning points of which every circle consists, from its non-existent beginning to its imaginary end, mentioning as well with mirthful melancholy of eternity, which has no permanent direction and keeps coming back onto itself. And he spoke with such serene religiosity that it had a brief calming effect on the prosecutor, Pavarant. Now, on the one hand, the circle that keeps turning back on itself is a fit symbol for the residents at this point, each of whom is locked within his or her own obsession in an attempt to escape a void of emptiness within. And especially, one might say, it serves as a symbol of Pavarant's own maddening fixation on a number that is beyond calculation. But on the other hand, the circle that Hans describes is a potent symbol that discloses, and has heretofore in the novel disclosed, a unity, a wholeness, and a purpose in life that Hans now remembers. It's an image of unity suggested elsewhere, you remember, by the circlet that Papercorn made with his fingers, the circle that Hans had made in the snow, which led him back to the shed where his dream vision occurred. Well, it is no wonder then that in describing the circle to Pavarant, that Hans, even in his stupor, can speak of the mystic circle with, quote, serene religiosity. Nevertheless, far from being immune to this great stupor, Hans, indeed, we're told, was one of its most serious cases, because the obsessive diversion that he adopts is the game of solitaire. It's a dangerous fixation for two reasons. First, it's a fascination predicated upon a feeling that life itself, like the cards that Hans turns over in solitude, operates not by some higher purpose, as his dream had suggested, but rather through random chance. Hans finds the sense of randomness both horrifying, but also strangely and dangerously alluring. Hans Castorp played solitaire everywhere, at any time of day, at night under the stars, in the morning in his pajamas, at meals, even in his dreams. He shuddered as he played. I'm just laying cards out, he thought, wrestling with abstract chance. I'm intrigued by its fickle tricks, the way it can toady up to you and then suddenly turn incredibly obstinate. Now, Hans senses that the world itself, like the cards, is skewed, trapped in a kind of chaos. He sees this chaos all around him, and for the first time since his arrival at the Berghof, Hans now, in the face of that, feels a desire to leave the sanitarium, to leave the great stupor, and leave the sense of meaningless, pointless activity behind, a activity that he knows on his part and on the other residents is all an attempt to mask an underlying existential dread. But even though Hans's learning has come to a stop in this stupor, and even though he no longer has any real hope for Klavdia's return as a motive for staying, still, he is afraid to act on the thought of leaving and returning to the flatlands. Thus, Hans's temperature continues mysteriously high as a manifestation of that resistance to the departure that he is now tempted toward, if only briefly. And indeed, Hans, I think we realize, if he did descend to the flatlands of Germany, back to the north, he would find the same stupor there as he finds at the Berghof, with some of the same symptoms. Because while the sanitarium is in some respects a world apart, it is in others a microcosmic reflection of the European society as a whole, which its residents represent in their multiple nationalities. It's a world, in short, in which, around 1912 at this point, in which those countries represented by the residents, specifically Germany and France and Russia and Britain, have turned in on themselves in restless discontentment, have as nations drifted off on their own and are becoming swept up in their own mania, the mania of nationalism that will propel the world into war a few years later. There are signs and symptoms of this in the inward turning of the residents of the Berghof, who reflect those nations. Now, this symptomatic withdrawal from others and into oneself is the second great danger that Hans's particular form of diversion, solitaire, poses. He scarcely listens when Settembrini visits now and tries to explain the political developments in Europe that are ironically reflected in Hans's own self-isolating mood and habits. The game of solitaire is like the treatments he is receiving from barons at this moment as well. Treatments in which we're told Hans is now being injected with a serum made from his own blood. It's a futile, self-referential treatment. Quote, a disgustingly joyous diversion, a self-incestuous abomination that can produce, so it seems, no good. He submitted nonetheless to the therapy, though he found it ridiculous and disgraceful, this vaccination of himself with himself. And the result was zero, for there was never expressly announced. The entire enterprise fizzled out, and Hans Castorp went on playing solitaire, eye to eye with the demon, the great lethargy, whose unrestrained power he could not help feeling was sure to come to some horrible end. Hans goes eye to eye with this demon of lethargy, and he is not, however, as in the snow chapter, facing death itself, so that through some terrifying initiative encounter with it, he can discover the key to life. No, Hans's encounter here, when we're told that he was eye to eye with the demon, his encounter here, as he plays solitaire, is with rather a state of life in death rather than death itself. Moreover, it is not, as in Snow, an encounter that is resistant, but rather one in which he is submitting to a compulsion, to which he is yielding. It is an encounter then, as he plays solitaire, with this state of cynical hopelessness and isolation, this state of life and death that he is encountering and that he fears and senses may lead to, quote, some more horrible end. Indeed, lethargy leads to the war within its consequences, and indeed that sense of a coming war that grows out of this inward turning state of lethargy will become all the clearer in the next subsequent chapter, The Great Petulance. But Hans doesn't name the particular horrible end that Mann refers to, any more than Hans directly confronts death in this numb, devitalized state. So what saves Hans then from this ontological funk, from this inward turning paralysis, this numbness and cynicism that seem so antithetical to his character heretofore? What saves him? Well, we find the answer in the chapter, The Fullness of Harmony, I think one of the novel's richest chapters. Hans discovers a renewed sense of life and purpose when something greater than a mere diversion arrives. It is a state-of-the-art German-made gramophone and a large collection of recordings. The mysterious sound box exerts, quote, a hidden magic that had been missing in the community and in Hans's life recently. First of all, if only temporarily, the music pulls individuals out of their self-isolating manias and private depressions through the shared enchantment of musical sound. Patients gather round the gramophone to listen and even to dance. Hans values this community, and indeed he promotes it. But he finds another more personal appeal in the machine, and in an epiphanic moment, he assumes the role of the gramophone's custodian, operator, and keeper of the record collection. Somewhere inside him, a voice said, "Wait, look out. An epic begins here for me." Hans was filled with the very definite premonition of a new passion and enchantment, a new burden of love. What he felt was no different from what a lad on the flatlands feels when he casts that first glance at a girl and Cupid's barbed arrow unexpectedly pierces his heart. Suddenly there was jealousy in each of Hans Castorp's strides. Public property? No. Flaccid curiosity has no right to property, no strength of ownership, he thought. "Let me do that," he said, between clenched teeth. And with that, taking the record, he was quite content. They were quite content to let him. He became the proprietor, the custodian of the gramophone. Now, the burden of love, that phrase in the passage I just read, that Hans feels at this moment, suggests that he is now moved by this machine and its music to re-embrace that love of life and that vision of love and humanity that he had glimpsed in his dream vision in snow and had there vowed to carry forth in his life as he had done for some time, certainly in his richer love with Claudia. Now, it is not really a new passion, one might say here then, but the reignition of an old one, of an old feeling and vision of love. Hans's love is a burden, to use Mann's word, insofar as it requires casting off his great compulsive stupor, his mania for solitaire as a response to it. But he finds that the gramophone awakens records into sonorous life and that the record albums present, quote, "a world of beautiful possibilities waiting to be conquered." Hans is pleased to be the dispenser of these possibilities, of these beautiful pleasures, almost as Papercorn had been, though in a different way. Certainly the circular records recall Papercorn's eloquent circlet gesture, and one might imagine that Hans is sharing the music here with the community, and in so doing sharing himself almost as Papercorn shared in his Christ-like way the bread and wine. Part of the enchantment that Hans feels on seeing and hearing the record-playing device has to do with the shape of the records themselves, circular discs that reveal beauty and that conjure joy. The Mountain.8 discs were different colors, but otherwise the eye could not differentiate them. Each looked like the other. Each was filled to the center, or almost to the center, with a dense pattern of concentric circles. And yet this delicate tracery contained more sound than one could imagine, exquisite renditions of the happiest inspirations from every domain of the art of music. And thus the sense of the mysterious emanating from these similar-looking black discs. For Hans, the gramophone points to that same creative mystery at the heart of life that he had glimpsed in snow, the mystery of harmonious life and beauty that rises above and emerges out of an awareness of death. Because here is how Mann repeatedly describes the music box itself. The vibrations produced amazing effects near their source, but like all ghostly things, quickly languished with distance, grew feeble, their powers merely illusory. Within these four walls, Hans Castorp was alone with the wonders of this apparatus, with the lush achievements of this little truncated coffin of fiddlewood, this small, dull black temple with its doors flung wide open. The singers he listened to, but could not see, had bodies that resided in America, in Milan, in Vienna, in St. Petersburg, and they could reside where they liked because what he had was the best part of them, the voice, and he valued this purified form, this abstraction that still remained physical enough to allow him real human control and yet excluded all the disadvantages of too close personal contact. Note that for Hans, then, he finds in the sound of this spinning record a reminder and a kind of recrudescence of the unity of opposites at the heart of existence that he had seen in snow and had dreamed of and then found embodied in Papercorn, because as the passage suggests, in listening to these recordings, Hans feels the singers, both absent and present. They are ghostly abstractions, and yet they also seem physically present in their voices. They are accessible and yet not in close physical contact. Even as the music itself, emanating from this little coffin, seems to suggest a kind of harmonious and humane beauty arising out of what Hans conceives of as a coffin-like image of death. The unity of experience that he feels in listening to this music even combines separate sensory responses. Hans experiences the sound synesthetically at times, as the fragrance of lilacs. Well, beyond the general enchantment and the call to life that Hans experiences in the gramophone, he also finds specific and personal meaning in 5 of the recordings, of the records that came along with it. And as Mann explains how each of these affects Hans, we realize that taken together, these recordings, these musical compositions, summarize Hans's past life at the Berghof, even as they also point ahead to his future. Not surprisingly, 2 of Hans's particular favorite pieces, which he never tires of playing in the wee hours of the night, are associated with phases of his relationship with Claudia. One of them is Bizet's Carmen, which he had alluded to in explaining to Papercorn that he was not, like the opera's soldier hero, Jose, a jealous man who would kill his lover for her infidelity, the way Jose kills Carmen. No, instead, Hans, in the opera, identifies with Jose in another way and listens, quote, in rapt sympathy to an aria in which Jose is torn between all the values of his former life as a soldier and his desire for Carmen. In much the same way we know Hans was torn between upholding the values of his former bourgeois life early in his stay at the Berghof, on the one hand, in his passion for the reckless, seductive Claudia, a woman who is not unlike the seductive gypsy woman, Carmen. Both of them Dionysian individuals, both of them women of fatal charm, women who mock and belittle them for their conventional scruples and restraint, and we're told certainly of Carmen, but also of Claudia, a woman whose highest ambition was to triumph over that principle of restraint in the man who adores her. Well, no wonder Hans identifies. It's a phase of his life, his early longing for Claudia. Hans recalls his own, quote, agonizing situation, his own inner turmoil, but he relives these feelings also with a sense not just of excitement, but also painful nostalgia, because now, as he listens, that Claudia that he had desired with such ardent and dangerous passion is gone. He has nothing of her now except her X-ray. And this feeling of loss and longing for Claudia inform Hans's attraction to a second record, Verdi's opera Aida, which is about the forbidden love of Radames and the slave girl Aida in ancient Egypt. The duet that Hans cherishes is, quote, as a lonely nocturnal listener, is when the two lovers are unexpectedly and ecstatically reunited as Radames sits in his cell awaiting execution. The scene for Hans is a kind of wish fulfillment fantasy of a reunion with Claudia that he desires but knows will probably never happen. But more than this, the music of passionate love on the threshold of death brings a sense of consolation, as Mann describes it. 2 people were being buried alive. Their lungs full of the gases of the crypt. Cramped with hunger, they would perish together, or even worse, one after the other, and then decay would do its unspeakable work on their bodies until 2 skeletons lay there under those vaults, each indifferent and insensitive to whether it lay there alone or with another set of bones. That was the real, factual side of the matter, a set of facts that stood all to itself. That had nothing to do with the idealism of the heart and that was triumphantly vanquished by the spirit of beauty and by the music. For the Radames and Aida of the opera, this factual future, of course, did not exist. No, we don't see them as bones. They rather let their voices sweep in unison to the blessed sustained note of the octave, secure in the belief that heaven was opening before them and that their longings were bathed in the light of eternity. The consoling power of beauty to gloss things over did its listener a great deal of good and contributed much to Hans's special fondness for this segment of his favorite concert. This is a rare moment for Hans because he usually faces death in seeking knowledge and faces it directly. But now, listening to this aria from Aida, he instead turns away from death, turns away from the factual future of what will follow after the opera ends in this world of death and decay, one in which mortal men and women will be reduced to the horror of reality, which is to say, they will be reduced to skeletons. The reality that the two characters are doomed here to execution and to moldering in the tomb. All of this is glossed over or suspended or held at bay by the splendor of their voices in unison and the splendor of Verdi's music. Two of Hans's other favorites move him, not because of his associations with romantic passion, but because they serve as anthems rather for aspects of his life of learning at the sanitarium. As he listens to Debussy's Afternoon of a Faun, Hans imagines himself similarly lounging in a kind of pastoral landscape of the kind that the faun with his goat legs does. Why? Because Hans too has lain similarly, passively, on his balcony, playing God in defiance of the expectations of the world below. Identifying with the young faun, Hans finds in his state of passive contentment and intellectual freedom the expression of both his love of learning and of his defiance of the world below, the world of action, the world of work, the world of busyness. We're told the idealized apotheosis, the music was the idealized apotheosis of a total refusal to obey Western demands for an active life. This is what he finds and identifies with in Debussy's Afternoon of a Faun. Now, in remaining at the Berghof as a learner, as life's problem child, Hans defied not only his family and his culture, but also defied both Settembrini and Joachim's calls for him to give up his intellectual acquisition and return to his bourgeois roots. Hearing Debussy's music soothes and reassures Hans's sense of the value of that resistance. It ratifies the sense that he is right to have done so. On the other hand, Hans's fascination with Gounod's opera Faust presents the desire for knowledge that he has undertaken in his stay there in a darker light. It is, after all, based on the legend of a man who sells his soul to the devil in exchange for forbidden knowledge. To some extent, Hans knows that his quest has led him to terrifying disclosures that most men would naturally turn away from. It has led him to visit dying patients, to dream of witches consuming a child, to visits with the Mephistophelian Krakowski in his dark analytic cell. But Hans doesn't actively identify with Faust, notwithstanding that pursuit of dark knowledge, because the Faust legend is not Hans's own myth. There's never a question, after all, for Hans of losing his soul in the pursuit of knowledge. Of dying, yes, but not of losing his soul. He transgresses against bourgeois values and against Settembrini's gospel of reason, but he does not, like Faust, transgress against God. Indeed, as Hans listens to the opera, as he listens to Faust, what moves him most is not Faust. Rather, it is an aria by Valentin, the soldier brother of Marguerite, the innocent young woman whom Faust seduces and impregnates. Faust later kills Valentin, But in the aria that Hans loves, he identifies with Valentin because Valentin reminds him of his dead cousin Joachim. Indeed, it will be this recording at the seance that seems to summon Joachim's spirit from the realm of the dead. And Hans loves it because he associates the aria with his cousin. Valentin sings of how he wants to go off to war, as Joachim had tried to do, only to return to the sanatorium and die. Quote, "The invisible singer wanted to go where the battle was the fiercest and the danger the greatest, and to meet the foe gallantly and devoutly." Little does Hans know that Valentin's words in the opera, as he plays them, foreshadow his own movement in the war at the end of the novel, when we see him fighting in the muddy battlefields of France, but not in the gallant way that Valentin sings of and that Joachim imagined that he would fight at, and certainly not in search of glory. That has nothing to do with why Hans goes to war. But by far the most important of the 5 recordings that Hans loves is the one that proves to be even more prophetic, I think, than the Valentin aria in Faust. It is Schubert's setting for the German folk song, The Linden Tree, a song that will be on Hans's lips as he sings it, disappearing from the novel in the chaotic maelstrom of World War I, very likely to his death. Hans doesn't foresee this coming when he is so infatuated by the linden tree, but the song nonetheless moves him more than any other in the collection. We're told that the most overpowering phrase of the melody occurred 3 times, always in a modulating second half, the third one and then being in the reprise of the last half stanza that begins, "And many now the hours," the magical phrase which we do not want to abuse with words, is found in the lines, "So many words of love." The word love moves and intrigues Hans the more he listens to it. The song meant a great deal to him, a whole world, a world that he evidently must have loved, or otherwise he would not have been so infatuated with the image that represented it, the universal state of mind that the song epitomized so intensely, so mysteriously. What was this world that stood behind the music, which his intuitive scruples told him was a world of forbidden love? It was death. But that was sheer madness. A beautiful, marvelous song like that, a pure masterpiece born out of the profoundest and most sacred depths of a whole nation's emotions, its most precious possession, the archetype of genuine feeling, the very soul of human kindness. What hateful slander! Oh, my. That was all very pretty, was what an honest man would have to say. And yet behind this sweet, lovely, fair work of art stood death. But to feel spiritual and intellectual sympathy for it was, after all, then, to feel sympathy for death. The song means everything to Hans because it seems to summarize his own life and also the universal state of mankind, as he puts it. But in what sense? Well, first it captures the pain of lost love, as the speaker in The Linden Tree, who is leaving for war, says that he and his lover will never again meet beneath that linden tree where he had carved their names in the bark. Hans obviously identifies with this because he feels pretty certain that he will never see Claudia again, whom he has come to love in a more mature and life-affirming way through their shared devotion to papercorn. But the song moves Hans even more because the speaker foresees his death as he leaves for war and recalls the tree where he might have found peace as he goes off to battle. Looking back many hours away from that tree, he longs for it. And like the speaker, and Hans, like the speaker, affirms love and has affirmed love in the face of death, which will claim him in the depths of night as he sits and listens to it. Hans finds and acknowledges that he too has had a spiritual and intellectual sympathy for death, a sympathy for death that seems bound up with the willingness of the soldier speaker to go off to battle, no matter how sadly, and that his own long-standing sympathy for death, a sympathy, a lure for death that Hans resisted in Snow, is nonetheless distilled in the song, and Hans deeply identifies with it, therefore. He knows that death, quote, still holds a mighty enchantment over his soul, even as he has affirmed and valued life. The question then becomes, given Hans's attraction to this song, and his attraction both to the words of love in the song and to the sense that it is, after all, predicated, this beautiful, marvelous song, upon the recognition of death which stands behind it, the question is, can Hans then himself continue to resist the lure of death and affirm life, as he had done in the dream vision? Or will he yield to death's enchantment? Well, in the extraordinarily rich final paragraph of the chapter, Mann offers, I think, a third possibility. It's what the song most powerfully suggests to Hans, and what will help us negotiate, I hope, the novel's final ambiguous ending. We're told that, but the song's best son may yet have been the young man who consumed his life in triumphing over himself and died a new word on his lips, the word of love, which he did not yet know how to speak. It was truly worth dying for, this song of enchantment. But he who died for it was no longer really dying for this song, and was a hero only because ultimately he died for something new, for the new word of love, and for the future in his heart. Ultimately, Hans understands Schubert's song neither as a simple surrender to death, nor as a simple act of resistance to death. Rather, he finds in the song yet another call to a fatal encounter or with death in the quest for life, and specifically in the quest for what Mann calls a new word of love. It's a search for some new vision of love that can manifest itself in the awareness of death, but a different one from what he saw in the dream of those beautiful, loving, peaceful men and women who know what is going on in the temple. That was love in the face of death too, but somehow he must find a new version. Hans the Quester is going to seek, under the inspiration of the linden tree, a new kind of love that can save or serve humanity in the brutal 20th century. A love that is still unknown, but one that Hans would like to believe can thrive when that reverent brotherhood that he dreamed of in Snow can no longer hold sway. To surrender one's life in quest of such a love, and to die seeking it, would for Hans be a consummation and an affirmation of life through the experience of death, that final grail quest. That is ultimately what the linden tree means to Hans, even though he cannot fully articulate it. That's what he takes from this song, and certainly that's why he sings its line of love as he crosses no man's land at the end of the novel in the final pages to what may well be his death. Now, I hope you played the link that I sent along and enjoyed it, and that you also read the lyrics. Hans's preoccupation with death, which we've seen throughout the novel, brings us now to one of the most fascinating and perplexing chapters in The Magic Mountain. Highly questionable. Krakowski's interest in the paranormal, what we would today call parapsychology, has led him beyond love as a source of disease to speculations on telepathy, thought transference, prophetic dreams, and other arcane riddles that he has been investigating through hypnosis. The arrival of the young virginal Ellie Brand from Denmark takes Krakowski and the residents far beyond what is psychologically explicable, however, far beyond what Krakowski could have expected. Ellie reports that she saw her sister's spirit at the moment the sister died, thousands of miles away in America. And Ellie's uncanny talent at games of discovery reveals that she is also, like Joan of Arc, quote, a maid who hears voices. In her case, however, it's not the voice of God, but rather the voice of a dead spirit who calls himself Holger and who whispers in her ear. He is initially described as an ethereal creature, something like a guardian angel, though clearly we'll see he is also in many ways a trickster. Hans feels deeply conflicted at the idea of encountering such a phantom from the world of the dead, a mixture of terror and curiosity, because after all, he has been fascinated by death since he was a little boy. So there is going to be, certainly, notwithstanding a certain degree of resistance, an underlying attraction to the idea of communing with death. He could sense in advance, Hans could, quite clearly, quite definitively, that however such experiences might develop, they would never seem anything but preposterous and incomprehensible and lacking in human value, and yet he burned to taste them. It was the unconditional curiosity of the tourist, thirsty for knowledge, a curiosity that in having tasted the mystery of personality, Papercorn had perhaps not been all that far from the realms of imagining here something also absolutely unknown to him. Now, Hans finds himself conflicted then in this response, but surrendering more and more to his curiosity. But what holds him back, or what is in tension with that curiosity, is not the sense that in seeking communion with the dead, he is transgressing against God, nor does he feel resistance in the face of that curiosity because he feels he is in some way transgressing against reason of the kind Settembrini has taught him to value. Rather, it's that Hans holds back in part because he feels these dabblings are a violation of decency. One doesn't dabble with death, which Hans in particular regards, remember, as solemn, as serious. It should not, after all, be a form of some kind of amateurish, speculative entertainment. Yet, his curiosity about death and his perpetual desire to learn from it and of it is so strong that he agrees to join in a seance. Using Ellie as medium, the group intend to bring Holger into communication with them through her. Essentially, they've constructed a kind of Ouija board with a round table, there's another one of the many, many circular images, and a glass that they hold as it moves from letter to letter around the table's circumference to spell out the words that are coming from the spirit. Now, at the start, Hans and the others approach this as a game in a kind of psychological sense. They assume that the communication that emerges will be the collaborative work of their unconscious wills, nothing more. Thus, each individual, they assumed, within this would be part of a blend of conscious, half-conscious, and subconscious elements, assisted and driven by the wishes of each person present, whether they admitted it to themselves or not. Each individual contributing more or less his or her own darkness, the strongest contribution probably coming from sweet little Ellie, but all of it somehow analyzable. They knew that they had assembled in the still of the night for an impure game with their own natures, a test of unknown components of their inner selves, and knew that they were waiting, frightened and curious, for pseudo or semi-realities that are called magical. It was almost merely for the sake of form, for convention, that the gathering presumed the ghosts of the departed would speak. That was a mere convention. That was a pretext. They don't believe for a moment that it's going to be anything more than a kind of group psychological phenomenon. But what happens, of course, is unexpected, startling, and highly questionable. The glass seems to rocket away on its own across the Ouija board, tapping out sounds that no one seems... There are tapping sounds that no one seems to be making, and Holger's answers through this movement across the board have a kind of fascinating wisdom in them, at least especially for Hans. Asked how long he has been Holger has been in his serene state of death, he responds, quote, a hastening while. A cryptic phrase, but one that suggests a state in which time is suspended, yet in which there is also rapid change and movement. It's a fit description of Hans's paradoxical sense of time at the sanitarium as something that is always the same and yet ever changing. It gets at the paradox, or one of the paradoxes of time that Hans has contemplated. Holger, who identifies himself as a poet, reinforces this temporal paradox in his verse, which describes the juncture of time and timelessness in his descriptions of the time-bound shore of sand and the eternal timeless ocean that borders on it. We're told in his poetry he described the great arc of the bay that rims the island's steep, doomed coast. Oh, look, its vast expanses hovering, melting, dying, green into eternity. Lie down up there in the sand. How cool, like death it feels. How soft, like silk, like flower. You clench your hand and it flows, a thin, colorless stream, to form a delicate mound beside you. Do you know that fine trickle? It is the soundless, slender rush through the straits of the hourglass. Sand extracted from eternity into time. Now, when Mann's narrator had speculated on time in the earlier chapter, A Stroll Along the Shore, it was from the perspective of life, that is, from the perspective of the shore, that he wrote. But Holger, being in the afterlife, speaks about time from the double perspective of both the shore, time-bound, and the sea, because he exists somehow in a state of changing timelessness. Holger answers a specific question that Hans asks concerning time. How long will I stay? Holger's answer is, quote, across his room 34. What does Holger mean by this? Perhaps he means that if one crosses over to Hans's room, on the door they would see the number 34, and the two numbers 3 and 4 add up to 7, which is the number of years that Hans will indeed spend at the Berghof. Could Hans have unconsciously generated these mysterious answers that prove true to his experience? Well, the most mystifying and inexplicable event at the seance is when the lights go out, possibly one of Holger's playful tricks, and Hans, in that darkness, finds that Claudia's X-ray, which had been in his room, is now lying in his lap. He keeps it as a love memento, but also it is an image of a skeleton, after all, as I've called it before, a memento mori, as Hans first conceived of X-rays when he saw his own. Now, it is then, it would appear, this X-ray in his lap, a sign of something. But of what? Is it a sign that the playful Holger has arranged, a sign that Hans will die, since after all it is the image of a skeleton? Or is it a reminder that Hans's initial attraction to Claudia carried with it a love of disease and therefore an attraction to death? Perhaps both. Well, when Krakowski learns of these developments, these mysterious developments that he is not immediately witness to, he becomes quite interested and moves these experiments to his chambers. But Krakowski soon realizes that the objects moving around the room and the apparitions that appear in Ellie's presence cannot be accounted for by telekinesis or by biopsychic projections of Ellie's subconscious complexes into the objective world. In short, they can't be accounted for by any psychological theory, because it is, after all, now not just Ellie who sees these apparitions, as would be the case if they were in fact her hallucinations. No, others in the room also see them as well. When Holger himself takes visual form, the power of science, even speculative science, to explain his image seems to break down completely. Well, despite Hans's skepticism, despite his initial resistance, and his dismay at the idea of a kind of undignified prankster spirit, and his resistance to the idea of meddling in death in a way that might seem frivolous. Despite all of this, he is so compelled by his curiosity to participate when Ellie agrees, via Holger, to summon up a dead person, a person known to one of the participants. Who will it be? Well, Hans makes his decision immediately, as soon as this possibility arises. We're told that Ellie had promised in her trance that the next time she would produce any deceased person that the group might demand to see. Any deceased person. Hans Castorp continued to hold back. Nevertheless, the idea that it could be any departed soul occupied his thoughts to such an extent that in the course of the next 3 days he came to the opposite conclusion. Or to be more precise, it did not take 3 days, but only a few minutes of one of them to accomplish this. He thought, idle and sinful or not, we would certainly be wonderfully strange, and it would be a very special adventure. And knowing him, Joachim, as I do, if he has anything to do with it, he won't hold it against me. All right. Now, you'll recall that Hans had watched his cousin die. He had observed his strange movements and tried to interpret them, tried in doing so to comprehend the experience of death, which, as Behrens explained, is something that the victim himself cannot grasp in the moment in which consciousness is extinguished. But that wouldn't be true, after all, if consciousness, in fact, was not extinguished, if it was not broken at the death of the body and continued after death. Well, this is part of what intrigues Hans. Now the prospect of understanding the mystery of death, if consciousness continues, compels Hans to join in an activity that he will later bitterly regret. But it is not just this intellectual curiosity about the nature of death. Hans is also moved by the prospect of seeing Joachim, whom he continues to mourn, in part to mourn because he has assumed all along that there would be no point even wishing for the possibility of ever seeing him. Well, Hans, who has faced death repeatedly, is alone in this group, in his willingness to encounter a dead person whom he loved. And it is only he who speaks up. Who has a wish at the ready? Who shall call friend Holger and reveal to us? Silence followed. Mann's narrator notes, what we call mourning is perhaps not so much the pain of the impossibility of ever seeing the dead return to life as the pain of not being able to wish it. Now there's an opportunity at least to wish it, so it would seem if one invests faith in the power of this seance. And so, turning his head to address the leader of the session, Hans Castorp said with a husky voice, I would like to see my dead cousin, Joachim Zeisman. And what followed now were the strangest hours of our young hero's life, the strangest he had ever known until then. And although we are not completely sure as to his later fate, we shall lose sight of him at a certain point in our story, we would like to think that they remained the strangest hours he would ever experience. Well, as the seance and the summoning of the dead commence, Hans holds Ellie's hands and her legs between his knees. And Mann describes her ordeal as a kind of childbirth, quote, an animated maternity, in which Ellie writhes and sweats and struggles in her hypnotic trance. But it is really a kind of double birth, because she must summon Joachim from death, first by summoning Holger himself. So it is a ghastly and dangerous process that is not bringing life into the world, after all, but is bringing death back into the world. But what with the terrible difficulties? It did not seem to want to proceed at all. And How could it? What madness? What sort of motherhood was this? A delivery? How and from what? Help, help, the child moaned, and her labor pains threatening now to become futile and dangerous and a constant cramp. The first hint that Joachim is accessible is when Hans sees Ellie's hands move, as Joachim's own hands had moved just before death, as if somehow his spirit has begun to enter into her and to make contact through this gesture of the raking of the hands. They first noticed that she was busy doing something rather curious, an activity with which the others seemed familiar, but that caught Hans Kostorp's attention. And he watched in amazement. For several minutes she reached out her cupped hand until it was about at her hip, and then pulled it back and stretched it out with a ladling and raking motion, pulled it back again, as if she were collecting or gathering something. Unlike Papercorn's expressive gestures, this raking motion remains non-communicative, uninterpretable. It is only when Hans asks his Czech compatriot to play Valentin's prayer from Faust, the one that he associates with Joachim, that aria, that the record, the sound of that aria, mysteriously and incongruously, by the way, turns up in a stack of light favorites. It is only then, after this mysterious appearance of the record, that Joachim's spirit appears and materializes. We are told, the record had come to an end. The last chords of the brass had died away, but no one turned off the machine. The needle moved to the middle of the disc and scratched idly in the silence. Now Hans Kostorp lifted his head, and without having to search, his eyes looked in the right direction. There was one more person than before in the room. There, off to the side of the semicircle in the background, where the red light was swallowed up in night that the eye could barely pierce, between the doctor's wide desk and the folding screen, there on the patient's chair turned toward the room where Ellie sat during the pause, there sat Joachim. It was Joachim, with the shadowy hollow cheeks and the warrior's beard from his final days, with lips arched, proud and full. He sat leaning back, one leg crossed over the other, another, whatever that was on his head, cast a long shadow. His emaciated face visibly bore the stamp of suffering and the same austere, earnest expression that had made him look so manly. 2 deep creases were engraved on his brow between his eyes, which had sunk deep into their bony sockets, although that did not distract from the tenderness of the gaze that came from those beautiful large eyes directed in friendly silence at Hans Kostorp, and at him alone. His one minor sorrow of long ago, his protruding ears, was not noticeable under whatever that strange unidentifiable thing was that he had on his head. This was no proper dress uniform he was wearing, no flash of color, no shiny buttons. No, it was a narrow tunic-like collar and side pockets, and a cross was dangling. And what was that thing on his head? It looked as if Joachim had plopped a bit of field gear, a cooking pot, down over his head, and then fastened it under his chin with a strap. The effect was properly warlike, and yet it was like something out of the past, a 16th century Languisette, perhaps. Strange. The image of Joachim that Hans and the others behold looks only at Hans with fondness, with tenderness. But it is not simply Joachim as he was near the end of his life. It is also Joachim now in a new prophetic form. His outfit is that of a soldier in World War I, an outfit none of the people at the seance would have been familiar with. Particularly the strange metal object on his head that seems atavistic, as if something out of the 16th century. It is actually, of course, a foreshadowing of the World War I helmet of the future, just a few years in the future. What Hans sees is Joachim as Joachim would have appeared had he lived as he had hoped to, and lived to fight in that war, one that has not yet begun to occur but is now nearing very, very closely. One in which Hans Kostorp himself, at the end of this novel, will find himself dressed for in much the same way, with the tunic and the strange pot-like helmet on his head that he sees, and the apparition of his cousin. Consider Hans's response, though. Far from finding knowledge of death that he has sought, or finding in this visit from Joachim consolation for a mourning that was rooted in his sense of the absolute pointlessness of ever hoping to see his cousin again, far from either the consolation or the knowledge through this strange visit from beyond, Hans finds instead that he is merely horrified, appalled at the brutality of the seance that has dragged Joachim back into life, enraged at Krakowski for orchestrating the seance, and deeply ashamed of himself for participating in it. For a moment, Hans thought he would throw up. His throat contracted and cramped in 4 or 5 fervent sobs. "Forgive me," he whispered to himself, and then the tears came to his eyes, and he saw nothing more. Hans Castorp was already at the door. With a flick of his hand, he turned on the white light to put an end to it, and then, leaving, he nodded menacingly several times directly at Krakowski's face, turned on his heels, and left the room. Hans asks forgiveness, not only of Ellie, who lies exhausted on his knees, nor merely forgiveness of God for dabbling in forbidden mysteries, but mostly he asks the forgiveness of Joachim for summoning him from his eternal rest back to the place where he had died, the place that Joachim had tried to leave. Hans apologizes for doing so mostly out of a kind of speculative curiosity about death, the kind of speculation in him that Joachim found so frustrating, and he apologizes for justifying that curiosity with the idea that just as Joachim was willing to allow him to see his X-ray, so too he won't mind if I summon him back from the dead. He blames himself for that. He feels guilty and he feels ashamed of it. But above all, Hans apologizes here to Joachim for operating in concert with Krakowski, whom Joachim had so deeply distrusted. He feels guilty in this sense for betraying his cousin by operating with a Mephistophelian tempter who has conspired to bring back a man from across the barrier of life and death. But did it really happen? Was it really Joachim who appeared? Well, Mann's chapter title, Highly Questionable, seems to resist a definite answer. What did Mann himself believe? Well, remember that a good deal of what Mann describes in this novel derived from his personal experience, beginning with the fact that in 1912 his Jewish-born wife developed TB and had to go to a clinic in Davos, Switzerland, which became the model for the Berghof and inspired the novel that Mann published 2 decades later, but only after essentially suspending work on the book for 5 years while the war was raging. Well, Mann was also personally interested in paranormal phenomena. And in fact, Mann did attend a seance himself with a combination of fascination and skepticism, not unlike Hans Castorp's own. What Mann found was that he couldn't disprove or explain away the summoning of dead spirits that occurred or seemed to occur. But how, he wondered, could one ever be sure of such a thing? Well, ultimately, Mann leaves the question of supernatural interventions into human life open-ended here. But Hans's fervent "forgive me" suggests, I think, that he at least has no doubt that it is in fact Joachim's spirit that he has helped summon or drag back from the realm of the dead. The great petulance chapter that follows brings the ominous prospect of war that was prophesied by Joachim's military dress still closer. Here, as in the Great Stupor, the sanitarium at large reflects the mood of the nations and the people in the world below. Now we're told what was in the air: a love of quarrels, acute petulance, nameless impatience, a universal penchant for nasty verbal exchanges and outbursts of rage, even for fisticuffs. Everyday fierce arguments, out-of-control shouting matches would erupt between the individuals among entire groups, an aching lust to join them tormented both body and soul, and whoever lacked the strength to flee to solitude was always drawn into the vortex of violence beyond all help. Now, Hans is not totally immune to this irrational aggression, but unlike the existential stupor that was quintessentially distilled in him, he is in this case more resistant to this particular petulance than almost anyone else at the Berghof. So he watches, for example, a normally silent patient verbally assault the dwarf server because his tea is cold, and Hans sees a rabid anti-Semite bait a Jewish guest until they descend into a fight in which they behave like depraved beasts, driven by an instinct to kill one another. They scuffled like little boys, but with the desperation of grown men who have come to such a pass. They clawed faces, pinched noses, clutched throats, all the while punching away at one another, grappling, rolling on the floor in terribly dead earnest. They spat and kicked and grabbed and trounced and whacked and frothed at the mouth. And Hans Castorp had never seen the phenomenon before, had never believed it could really occur. And yet it is. Writing in this chapter in the early 1920s, Mann, who would leave Germany for the United States when Hitler came to power, already seems to envision a malignant racist feature of German nationalism, one that was present in some inchoate form, he suggests, even in the build-up to the First World War. Certainly in the aggression against the Jewish man. The mood of aggression at the sanitarium clearly mirrors the hostility in Europe down below. The hostility of Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire on one side, and of France, Britain, and Russia on the other, all longing to destroy one another like the patients. The contagion spreads even to the intellectual Settembrini and Naphtha, though as we have seen, their ideological quarrels have already by this time become increasingly personal, as both men harbor private doubts about their antithetical worldviews. The fact that they are now both very ill, increasingly bedridden, only intensifies their dissatisfaction with the world, with each other, and ultimately with themselves, especially Naphtha, the little Jesuit-trained terrorist. He had called, remember, for war before, as a necessary prelude to the coming of God. But now, at a time when he had begun to question that mystical vision, Naphtha now begins invoking war not as a kind of spiritual hygiene, but for its own sake. The man who calls Settembrini's rational humanism a form of nihilism has in fact become more explicitly nihilistic himself than Settembrini ever could be. We are told that Naphtha's malice was now out of control. Indeed, it often went beyond the bounds of a sane, healthy mind. The unadmitted, secret, universal desire for war was another manifestation of it in Naphtha. It would come, he said. War would come, and that was fine. War, war. He was all for it. The universal lust for war seemed quite an honorable thing, he believed, in comparison with anything else that Settembrini might suggest. Now, there is nothing remotely spiritual about this bloodlust now. Indeed, we sense that this vision of Naphtha's is rooted not just in his inherent sadism, but also rooted in his despair, born of his inner doubts that have come through his debates with Settembrini, and more particularly as a result of that, with himself, what Mann calls that harrowing of his own soul, something that Settembrini has also been doing. When Joachim died, you remember, Naphtha had betrayed a sense of his own hopelessness in that curious remark he made, quote, "Only where there is no spirit are we respectable." Well, now, gravely ill, Naphtha, quote, endeavored to cast doubt on the very notion of spirit and revile it, to revile God and nature. He said, both are unjust. Well, if God is unjust, what then happens to the central tenet of Naphtha's dualism, the conflict between God and Satan for men's souls? It seems that everything collapses for Naphtha and that his ramblings become increasingly bitter, tortured, and incoherent as he harrows his own soul. And yet, they are also more personally and aggressively addressed to Settembrini, who has helped destabilize Naphtha's autocratic medieval belief system, much as Naphtha has worked to destabilize Settembrini's own Enlightenment humanism. Well, Naphtha's enmity for Settembrini, for life, and for himself build to a climax on an excursion where, after a self-congratulatory monologue on freedom directed to Hans, Naphtha challenges his counterpart to a duel. When Settembrini is appalled at what he sees as an attempt to molest vulnerable youth by corrupting the mind of Hans Castorp, and denounces Naphtha, here is what happens. Settembrini says, "You are unsettling the mind of wavering youth, seducing and morally weakening that mind. It is infamous and cannot be punished severely enough," Settembrini said. At the word infamous, Settembrini banged the palm of his hand on the table and stood up, shoving his chair back, a signal for them all to do the same. And as they stood there trembling, instinctively, watching, as Settembrini and Naphtha clenched their hands into fists. It was quiet. They could even hear Naphtha's teeth grinding. Naphtha was indeed gnashing his teeth in the silence, a horribly unpleasant, savage, bizarre sound, which at least served as a token of some dreadful kind of self-control. "I hope your civilian principles do not preclude your knowing what it is you owe me now," Naphtha said, "because otherwise I would be forced to find means to test those principles in a way that—" A sharp bow from Settembrini induced him to continue. "I see that will not be necessary now. I am in your way, you are in mine. Fine then, we shall find some appropriate venue for the settlement of our little differences." Now, when Settembrini rises and turns his back on Naphtha to address Hans, Naphtha knows that he has provoked that response in his antagonist, and he succeeds in doing so, in provoking Settembrini to this act of defiance and clearly bad manners. He succeeds in tempting this man of reason, first to intemperate behavior and then to agree to a duel, a barbaric, senseless combat that Settembrini announces is, quote, "a return to the primal state of nature," but one that nonetheless the rationalist implausibly insists that he must engage in, respond to, taking the bait. Well, Hans, in an attempt to stop the duel, pleads that there was absolutely no personal insult on either side, but only what he describes as intellectual difference. But Hans is, of course, quite wrong here. Naphtha's aggression and Settembrini's aggressive, defiant response were entirely personal. They hate each other not only for what the other represents, but more particularly for the doubts which they have infected each other with. Settembrini, despite his long-standing attempt to teach Hans and to steer Hans away from first Krakowski and then Klavdia and now Naphtha, nevertheless at this moment insists that Hans should remain neutral, an observer, not serve as his second in the duel. It's a remarkable gesture of respect that all concerned seem to see Hans's inherent right as the little lord of counterpositions to remain unresolved, even as they have attempted to shape his thinking all the way through heretofore. When the duel occurs in the snowy place, the same place of Hans's nosebleed, there is more bloodshed, but not in the way that anyone could have expected. As they face off, and Settembrini fires away, not at Naphtha. "You shot into the air," Naphtha said, controlling his temper and letting his own pistol sink. Settembrini replied, "I shoot in whatever direction I choose." "You shall fire again." "I wouldn't think of it. It's your turn." Lifting his head to gaze at the heavens, Herr Settembrini turned somewhat to one side instead of facing directly ahead. It was a touching sight. It was obvious that he had been told one should not offer one's foe a fully exposed chest, and was carrying out instructions. "Coward!" Naphtha screamed, conceding with this very human cry that it requires more courage to shoot than to be shot at. He raised his pistol to a position that had nothing to do with the duel and shot himself in the head. If Naphtha wins a victory by forcing Settembrini to defy reason and agree to the duel, Settembrini now wins a more painful victory in refusing to take Naphtha's life and offering instead his own, or at least risking it. What had Naphtha really wanted here? Well, to kill Settembrini, yes, but probably more deeply he wanted for Settembrini to kill him, because to do so would be for Naphtha a final triumph over the rational humanist he hates by forcing him to take this violent action, while at the same time it would in some way end Naphtha's own unbearably conflicted, bitter existence, so it would have a kind of double benefit. But Settembrini short-circuits that. Possibly at the last minute, he refuses to shoot at Naphtha, and Naphtha then turns the gun on himself, rather than Settembrini, who is offering himself sideways. And I think Naphtha shoots himself instead for two reasons. First, because Settembrini's now rational resistance to death and to the barbaric ritual itself signifies Naphtha's failure to corrupt him in the end, an unbearable defeat. He's gotten him to participate, but not to shoot at him. Thus, it's unbearable. And second, he shoots himself, I think, because what he sought most deeply in the conflict all along was self-extinction, I think even more than Settembrini's death. Well, as Naphtha cries coward and turns the gun onto his own head, he hurls his last futile insult at Settembrini, coward, and directs the violent aggression that he's always longed to express since he had watched his father slaughter animals. As a boy, he now turns that aggression not against others, but against himself. But perhaps Naphtha also foresees that in this act of killing himself, he will in some way damage Settembrini, the survivor who we are told goes into decline after Naphtha's suicide. Quote, "It was a terrible blow to Settembrini's sensitive nature, and he had been unable to get over it. In fact, Settembrini even abandons work on the literature of human suffering, to which he has devoted so much of his life. He now has too much of his own personal suffering to pursue that project. Guilt, regret, trauma, all of which are exacerbated by Settembrini's inner conflict over the political situation in Europe, make him incapable of writing. Now, with regard to that political situation, he is again tied in knots. Part of Settembrini, as a humanitarian, rational man of peace, wants to avoid war. But another part of Settembrini, after all, yearns for the violent extinction of the corrupt, autocratic Austro-Hungarian Empire. Certainly, as an Italian, he feels a particular animus against them. Settembrini, however, also distrusts Russia, which is, in this instant, Austria-Hungary's enemy. And indeed, the Tsar Nicholas has been seeking influence in the Balkans over parts of the Austro-Hungarian Empire to destabilize it. an influence that would soon lead to the assassination of the Austrian Archduke Ferdinand by a Serbian separatist that was really the spark that set the powder keg of World War I into motion and started its convulsions. Well, unfortunately, it's not just that Settembrini is torn between war and peace, but between the elimination of Austria-Hungary and the hatred of the country, Russia, that would allegedly or purportedly do that. Now, Hans sees the effects of this internal struggle as the war approaches on Settembrini's face, even though Hans himself has long since given up reading about the world below. It's all written too clearly on Settembrini. Then came the murder of the Archduke, which for everyone except our German sleeper, Hans, served as a storm warning, a word to the wise, among whom we have a good cause to count Herr Settembrini. Hans Castorp noticed how, as a private humane man, the Italian shuddered at that awful deed, but he also noticed how that chest rose at the thought that it was committed to a free nation and directed against the citadel of Austria-Hungary that he hated, hoping that through the destruction of Austria and Hungary, Italy will regain parts of Italian-speaking Europe that Austria-Hungary now occupies. Now, only with the outbreak of the war itself, weeks after this assassination, only then is the thunderbolt that shakes even the remote sanitarium strong enough to awaken Hans Castorp, who we learn now has been at the Berghof for 7 years. Mann's narrator calls those 7 years, quote, a mythic romantic bundle of time, one in which we've seen Hans has enacted, without consciously knowing it, his role as Grail quester, a seeker of knowledge and life through death. And it has been a 7-year period of learning, but one that Mann also describes, despite this intense intellectual enrichment, as akin to 7 years of sleep, in that it existed outside time as we normally understand it in the world below. It has been a productive sleep, if you will, to be sure, but one that must now end. Hans now awakens from this slumber as the war begins. It is the summer of 1914, and we realize that Hans has been at the sanitarium since the summer of 1907, even though Mann has never mentioned dates. Hans, in part to reflect the fact of Hans's own loss of ordinary temporal bearings. Note now that Hans, as he moves along, has long since before this disregarded external time. He has long since taken down his calendar. He's putting away his watch. But now, external time, that is time measured by space and recorded as history, while it may for Hans have been unreal time, nonetheless reasserts itself now on the historical stage as unavoidably real, as something that he cannot, he finds, turn away from. The thunderbolt itself, with which we are all familiar, was the deafening detonation of a great destructive masses of accumulated stupor and petulance, okay? All the stupor, all the petulance that preceded it now are discharged in this outbreak. It was, so to speak, in subdued, respectful tones, a historic thunderclap that shook the foundations of the earth. But for us, it is the thunderbolt that bursts open the magic mountain and rudely sets its entranced sleeper outside its gates. Uncharacteristically, Hans does not meditate upon this wake-up call. Instead, he is swept along with most of the other male residents of the Berghof, and he departs immediately. But why does he depart? Why does Hans go to war? Well, Mann's narrator withdraws from Hans's thoughts in the final chapter, but he offers hints of what motivates Hans, a man of peace and a man of contemplation, to enlist in this struggle for a country, Germany, that he has nearly forgotten. Does Hans, one might ask, like Zeno at the end of Svevo's novel, embrace the Great War with a desire for both cultural and personal self-destruction? No. It's not an apocalypse that Hans welcomes. Hans is not driven by a suicidal urge like Naphtha or even Papercorn. But neither is Hans a patriot like Settembrini, nor is Hans going to war to seek military glory as Joachim wanted to, nor is he moved by the nationalistic frenzy that sweeps many of the other residents of the Berghof to back their own nations. No, it's none of those more conventional things. Hans drew his legs back under him, stood up, looked around. He saw that the enchantment was broken for 7 years, and he was released, set free, not by his own actions, as he had to admit to his shame, but set free by elementary external forces for which his liberation was a very irrelevant matter. If life was to receive back her sinful problem child, it could not happen on the cheap, but only like this, in a serious, rigorous fashion, as a kind of ordeal, which in this case did not perhaps mean life so much as it meant 3 salvos fired in his, the sinner's, honor. Hans goes to war to confront death once again as what Mann describes as an ordeal. It is the key word here. His immersion in the war, the risk of death, challenges Hans once again to understand and embrace the mystery of life that demands a confrontation with death. Now, he has already confronted death in the snow, at the bedsides of the dying, in suicidal victims, and most recently in his encounter with Joachim's spirit. But this encounter with death is a new and more terrible ordeal, one which Hans probably will not pass through as he had his brush with death and snow, but in which, nonetheless, he might perhaps find what he is seeking. Can he? Will he? Well, as the narrator bids farewell to Hans, wiping away a tear a bit more ironically than Settembrini's tears on parting, the narrator takes a double perspective on Hans. In one perspective, he is above, looking down on the protagonist, seeing him as he disappears into the distance. This young man whose story ends now as he vanishes into the mists of battle. The narrator says from this distance that his omniscience can go no further because this is, after all, the end of the fiction. The end, therefore, not merely of Hans, but of the narrator himself, who is disappearing along with it. Farewell, Hans. Whether you live or stay where you are, your chances are not good. The wicked dance in which you are caught up will last many a little sinful year yet, and we would not wager much that you will come out of it whole. Well, Hans will almost certainly not survive the war, if we were to take that hint. But the narrator can't be absolutely sure, though he knows that the wicked war will go on for several more years. But in describing Hans, the narrator takes a second perspective. Here he impersonates, as he had done once before, an eyewitness who cannot enter into Hans's mind and can only report what he sees up close in a kind of ground-level eyewitness way. And he describes from this position of fearful immediacy the ghastly spectacle of the first industrial war in human history, a muddy stalemate from the beginning of trench warfare in which hundreds of thousands are lost in futile attempts to retake villages, which they will lose again, and in which the machinery of destruction demands cover and retreat again and again and again. 50-pound mortar shells explode near Hans as he moves across the field, seen from this angle. Shells that reduce human bodies to fragments. The narrator describes him laden with horror. This product of science, gone berserk, crosses 30 yards, the shells in front of him, and buries itself in the ground and explodes like the devil himself, bursts inside the earth with ghastly super strength, and casts up a house-high fountain of soil fire, iron, lead, and dismembered humanity. For two men had flung themselves down there beside one another. They were friends, commingled now. They vanish. In such a place, at such a turn, when advanced Christian nations destroy one another with weaponry produced by science, the vision of humane love flourishing in the face and knowledge of death, that old love that Hans had glimpsed in his dream in snow, is now impossible to believe in. Youngsters with their backpacks and bayoneted rifles, with their filthy coats and boots, and in watching one might almost see them with a humanistic, beatific eye, might dream of other scenes. One might imagine such a lad spurring a horse or swimming in a bay, strolling along the shore with a girlfriend, his lips pressed to her gentle beloved's ear, or in happy friendship instructing another lad with a string bow, as Hans saw in his dream. And instead, no. They all lie, noses in the fiery filth. The war obliterates that dream of humanistic love that Hans had seen and striven for in snow. It is precisely because this vision of kindness, generosity, and reverence for life that Mann alludes to there and that Hans saw now fails. It is precisely because of that failure that new love that Hans had thought about must now be born. Some other kind of love that can somehow look at death and survive in the 20th century. That, remember, was the meaning that Hans drew from the Song of the Linden Tree. And this new love is what he now, as the seeker, pursues in and through the ordeal of combat and facing death. And it is for this reason that he sings the Schubert song, and sings particularly the lines of love as he struggles to stay alive in a battle where indeed he might very well die. Look, he is stepping on the hand of a fallen comrade, stepping on it with his hobnailed boots, pressing it deep within to the soggy, branch-strewn earth. But it is him all the same. Watch this. He's singing the way a man sings to himself in moments of excitement without even knowing, and he uses what tatters of breath he has left to sing to himself. Upon its bark I carved there so many words of love. Will Hans, in this ordeal, find that love, that new love he's seeking in confronting death? Will the quester, who never consciously recognizes the myth he's enacting, find that grail of new love, a knowledge of this new love, in this terrible initiation of fire and mud and metal? Well, we don't know. But in the novel's final lines, the narrator poses that very question of survival, not just the survival of Hans Castorp and the possibility of meaning for Hans Castorp, but the possibility of the survival of mankind and of the discovery of a new kind of meaning, a new kind of love. When he writes, "There were moments when, as you played king, Hans Castorp, you saw the imitation of a dream of love rising out of death and this carnal body, and out of this worldwide festival of death, this ugly, rotting fever that inflames the rainy evening sky all around. Will love someday rise up out of this too?" Well, love, of course, as we've seen, is a notoriously ambiguous word in this novel. But as Mann suggested earlier, it's the very imprecision of the word love that reflects its infinite range of possibilities, old and new, carnal and spiritual. Mankind, he suggests, needs to find a new, still unknown conception and expression of love. The novel ends at the start of the war that Mann lived through before writing most of the novel. He was not the same man after the war that he was before, having stopped writing for 5 years in between. And I think this change in Mann is reflected in his use of that word wicked as he looks back to characterize this completely unnecessary and obscene struggle, born of nationalism, born of economic greed, born of alliances between nations. Although Mann dreaded the start of the First World War, When that war broke out, he actually defended Germany's aggressive role in prosecuting it. And he did so in an essay that he repudiated later after he saw what the conflict had led to. The essay in question is called Reflections of a Non-Political Man. And in it, Mann refers to politics as the democratic systems of Britain and France that Settembrini so reveres. They are political systems, that is to say, democratic systems. But Mann believed the democratic systems were wrong for Germany, whose people, he said, were inherently non-political, that is to say, not interested in egalitarian political systems. I myself confess that I am deeply convinced that the German people will never be able to love political democracy simply because they cannot love politics itself. There are highly political nations that are never free of political stimulation and excitement, that still, because of a complete lack of ability and authority in governments, have never accomplished anything on earth and never will. The Poles and Irish, for example. On the other hand, history is nothing but praise for the organizing and administrative powers of completely non-political nations such as Germany. No misunderstanding should arise when people like me declare the political spirit to be alien and impossible in the spirit of Germany. Germany can be a great country, a great nation, without what Mann refers to as politics, that is to say, democratic politics. Well, after the First World War, Mann repudiated this, and it is worth knowing that his belief, when he wrote this essay in 1918, his belief in strong authoritarian leadership like that of the Kaiser changed considerably. Because although Mann in The Magic Mountain sometimes mocks Settembrini's egalitarian idealism, on the other hand, he saw all too clearly in Naphtha, in his autocratic mysticism, something that was already in the early 1920s beginning to brew in Germany and would become fully manifest later in the 1930s. What he seemed to sense here, and which he also senses in a wonderful short story, Mario and the Magician, is the rise of fascism. And it was all too clear, I think, to Mann after World War I, where non-political Germany was headed. It was headed in the direction that would eventually lead to Adolf Hitler. Okay, again, it's a long lecture, and I apologize. I will simply end with this anecdote. When I first read The Magic Mountain, I was probably not much older than you were. I think it was my first year in graduate school, so I was 22 or 23. And I read it, finished it just about this time of year because I remember I had gone back to visit my parents over the Easter break, and I read for about 4 straight hours, concluding it in an absolute state of exhilaration. And when I finished, I noticed that there were tears running down my cheeks, which is unusual because I'm not someone who weeps very often or very easily. And I realized upon reflection that I was weeping not because Hans Castorp is going off to die, but because the novel had ended and I simply wanted it to go on and on. I don't know if you feel that way, but I'll see you again next Tuesday, okay? Bye.